Welcome to the podcast, Lithos. I know that you've come from South Africa recently and you've moved to Ireland, and a lot has happened in between that time. But I'd like to thank you for coming on here.
Yeah, like an entire war starting overnight.
I mean, technically it didn't start overnight. I mean, Russia just invaded Ukraine. I mean, a lot of people didn't think it was going to happen, but, well, it's happened now, and there's a lot of complications that come from this. A lot of different things are affected, including here in America, halfway across the world from, just that, the invasion from Russia. How is it over there in Ireland currently?
I mean, we haven't seen too much of an influence from the war. Oil prices have gone up. I think over the span of a month, it's doubled the price of heating oil for the place I'm staying in at the moment.
So were your prices like rising in anticipation of this?
Um, See, I'm not too sure about that because I got here after the war started, so I can't really say too much about how it was before the war.
Okay, because I know some really unique effects were happening in the United States right now, where because of this armed conflict, starting in around, let me see my charts right here, around April in 2021, there is a large increase in gold. And now in March 2022, we can see that it's risen almost double from that point. So gold is actually coming to rise in value, which is just an explanation to show how much a currency is getting influenced by this war. Because I can see from October 2021 to 2022, we can see that gold just continues to rise. And we know that the Russian ruble overnight has dropped to 80% of its value?
Yeah, but do you think the whole gold's price rising could have something to do with the gold from Russia being imported less due to the sanctions and such?
I mean, the thing about it is that Russia is a major supplier of raw materials like aluminum, nickel, palladium, copper, and I think that this disruption, because of course there's going to be sanctions coming out from all different countries from it. I think the lack of import from these raw materials are definitely going to rattle an already strained global supply chain, and so I think that the already impacted supply chain in the United States, which is still barely recovering from the previous years from all the restrictions from the government, I think that's just going to drive prices up even more.
And the one hacking attack on the pipelines and the fact that some of your pipelines are being closed down.
Yeah, there was that whole fiasco where people were putting gasoline in bags, and people were saying, "Don't put gasoline in bags." It's I mean, common sense. I mean, you can go buy a jerry can for $20, a plastic little red can. Yeah, they were that the hacking of those southern pipelines in the United States was either, we will never know if it was a coordinated attack, a state-sponsored attack, or just an individual group looking to just extract money from them. It could be a probing attack for future stuff, but I mean, it's just showing that Russia some Russian people might have just aggression towards the U.S. So whether or not the scope may be focused on Ukraine, I think Russia saw the implications of basically affecting every single nation intertwined with their economy, and that they might be in a position to survive it. Now, I know...
Well,
go on.
Here's the thing. I think people forget that since globalization started, the supply lines and supply chains of the world have become increasingly and exponentially more complex over the years. Because you may not think it, but a country like Cuba will be influenced by something like this happening in Ukraine and Russia.
I mean, with Europe being so heavily energy dependent on on Russia for their stuff, they don't have any leverage to negotiate against Russia. And currently NATO and the UN has no contractual obligation to defend them. And so basically the only people who are benefiting right now in the West is Raytheon and other lobbyists selling arms and getting arms deals to Poland, Ukraine, and other European nations near, Russia. I think that with the also cancellation of the approval from Germany for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline of Europe, that not Russia, my bad, that Europe is also going to see one of their greatest energy crises that they've ever faced currently. I think that if this continues to keep going, they might end up like rationing their supply because they get almost like 70% of their oil from Russia or energy.
Yeah. A bit of a oversight on their part to start closing down old nuclear reactors because they're not properly or maintaining them, or they think they're too dangerous, even though they supply a ton of the energy. I get that they're expensive and all, but until you have something else to replace it, you may as well keep it open.
I mean, this isn't the first time that Ukraine has been in a war with Russia. I mean, in 2014 we had the mock, not the mock, but it was a sizable invasion of Crimea and the civil unrest that was following that. And I remember in 2010 that Putin, restructured the government's debt, and so basically they can afford to pay higher interest rates than their inflation. And I think, according to budget balance and surplus or deficit in Russia in rubles, their overnight interest rate was 9.5, while inflation was at 8.8%, which means they could credibly fund any deficit spending without inflating their currency further. And, well, however, I think Russia does not have the fund deficit spending because, they reacted to COVID by cutting and spending a running budget surplus. So I think Russia put themselves in a position far before to be able to survive this war. But I want to know what you think about what the other countries are going to be able to survive. How are they going to, recuperate from this?
See, NATO and Western countries, their economy dwarfs Russia's, so even with the fuel bans, they're still going to be able to keep the interest rates low and the inflation low because their GDP is just so that high. I mean, the UK on its own has twice the GDP of Russia, surprisingly. But
well, isn't since the the European Union had its whole infighting, like with focusing significantly on fighting their inflation by cutting government spending and stuff, like. I think that while they might have a more valuable currency than the U.S. and the U.S. dollar and the ruble, I think that like Europe's participation in this matter would be very slim, considering they have a lot of things on their plate to actually correct.
Well, at the moment, NATO currently recommends that nations spend 2% of their GDP on military, but not all countries are doing that. In fact, the number of military the amount of military equipment in places like France and Germany, if they were the ones fighting Ukraine and they had the same losses as Russia, their armored battalions would be completely gone by now. So,
all right. So in defense spending, let's see, from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, April 2021, the current defense spending of Australia, Italy, South Korea, Japan, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, Russia, India, and China combined reached to a collective $761 billion, while the United States is at $778 billion. So even with the current amount that Europe is fighting with their inflation and the cutting government spending, they are very, very small in comparison to how much the U.S. is spending. So if anyone is going to have the capability to, be a power player in this, it would be the United States and China. And I expect that, the basically the finish of this entire conflict is probably going to end up with Russia annexing Donetsk and Luhansk. And I think what's going to happen is China and Russia are going to become best buddies. Because I think we already saw that Visa and a bunch of other credit card, banks and stuff were basically halting operations. And I know a bunch of other places, like I think McDonald's came out and was like, we will no longer sell stuff in, Russia. Support Ukraine.
Here's the funny thing is, the government officials in China have actually stated to the news, or told their own news distribution networks and such, to take a neutral stance whenever talking about Russia, not
which
to
is,
become
I
make
think,
it seem like they're buddy buddy.
yeah, which is I'm surprised that, even though this is mainly about Russia, I think I'm surprised that China didn't make a move on Taiwan right now. I think that if Taiwan is in China's sight, if the US does any type of move in Ukraine in terms of like physical troops and stuff, I think that China's going to invade Taiwan. However, if the U.S. just continues economically supporting them with like, maybe weapons and, vehicles and things like that, I think they're going to bide their time a little bit more, wait on that, because they still see Taiwan as a part of their country. And I think, doing an invasion into that during an act of war, it would be invading technically their own waters or international waters. That would be, and that would basically pull us into a whole World War III. And right now,
I mean,
comparing,
that kind of sounds like a repeat of what Japan did to America in World War II.
yeah, that's practically what would start it. I mean, would you think that this is classified as the Lend-Lease portion of World War III, like what World War II had with the U.S. and Lend-Lease?
Well, seeing as how they're already sending stingers and javelins and such, I think it's already there.
We really can only guess on what's going to happen right now. I mean, a lot has happened already in a couple of days and since which it's started. A lot of things are just a lot of things have been shaken up, but I expect a lot more drastic things to happen in the next 2 weeks or so, because then everything's going to be adjusted. Every company is going to take their stance. They're going to, shift their assets. In Ireland, how connected is Ireland to the English for their energy supplies?
Um, Funny thing is, I'm actually not too sure about where Ireland gets its energy from.
Really? I mean, you did just move there.
Yeah, I haven't really looked into the whole energy production or industrial capabilities of Ireland, so
Because I think, to my knowledge, um, in Ireland 2050, the Energy Institute in there, they get about 45% of their own energy from coal-fired natural gas, which I think, even if you were to assume that Northern Ireland had more economic ties with the rest of the European, nations,
actually would be less because Britain is no longer part of the EU, so
that
Northern
is
Ireland
true.
would have
Yes, that is
less.
true. I think the energy independence of Ireland, having half of it be coal-fired power plants, it's pretty safe to say that you guys really, might not experience too much of an energy price hike. I think that you're going to probably see a decent portion increase just from the fact that trade also plays a part in this in decreasing the actual
Yeah.
cost of how much it sells to the consumers.
Although I will tell you one thing, after going to the store a bunch, I've noticed that pretty much all the food and products in the grocery stores are made in Ireland. So we're pretty self-sufficient in that regard.
Do you know what like you import most in terms of food supply?
Um, if I had, I couldn't really say.
I mean, I think you guys might export some potatoes, but that might be a bit 200 years too late or so.
Yeah,
But all right, well,
I mean, since America has banned all of vodka in their stores, maybe they could get new ones from Ireland.
don't you? Yeah, you need potatoes for vodka, right?
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
funny. I
100% alcohol vodka is just pure potato juice.
I find it funny that for the past couple years, the 4 years since like 2016, the media has been priming people to hate the Russians. Not maybe as the people, but maybe just as the government itself. They've just been so bent on pointing them as the enemy, like, they were the ones meddling with an election. And whether or not that's true, that's not what I'm debating. What I'm saying is that I think now we're seeing a bunch of deep-rooted like feelings and emotions coming out with places, not taking business in Russia, which you can be the judge of that. But we also have like banning Russian vodka. You already bought it, you might as well just sell it and not buy more. But taking vodka, taking it off your shelves and either destroying it, I just think it's wasteful. You know what I mean? You already purchased for that, but
Yeah, you've already spent the money, so why not just sell it and get rid of it, or at least give it to the people working for you.
That is very true. But then again, that's probably not a virtue signal, because it's like, hey, why are you giving all this vodka to your employees and stuff? But I think
throw a massive anti-Russia party with a bunch of vodka.
yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time someone's held a party during the whole COVID stuff. But I think that's all we have time for today. I think we have another podcast about next week, so we should probably come back with some more information about how all this is going to turn out. That's going to be quite interesting. But thank you for coming on, and have a good day. Well, welcome back. It's been a couple of days since, about a week or so. A lot of stuff has happened as well. Some new posturing from places, and we've got our guest.
The VDV capturing being pushed out multiple times of an airfield.
I mean, the Hostomel airport is I mean, that's up next to the Ghost of Kiev. Whether it's propaganda or not, it's important for those on the ground to have something to cling on to, some type of morale increase or boost, as you could say.
A guardian angel.
A guardian angel, yeah, and in this case, quite literally one. But I'd like to get started on some interesting things that have happened somewhere differently than Russia. Something that actually does have some good analysis to do with what's happened in globally because of this. In New Zealand, we saw that basically their interest rate is a 0.25% rise, and what they've managed to do right now is they've managed to take their overnight interest rate to be at pre-pandemic levels. So with the posturing that New Zealand has put themselves in to basically decrease their balance sheet holdings and take a loss on those if they were to hold them all the way to like a 2 to 3% overnight rate, we can see that many countries and nations are like putting themselves in a good position financially, either to try and take advantage of the situation or to try and recover from it. And I know New Zealand has been a major non-NATO ally of the United States since 1997. However, they are partaking in supplying weapons and stuff to, Ukraine, to say. So it's a bit of contradiction on their part. But what that has to do is that nations other than Russia are kind of getting into this fray. Do you know what Ireland is doing currently?
Well, recently Ireland has started a program to allow Ukrainian refugees in without a visa, or I can't remember if there was some other documentation required, but yeah, they're basically free to enter the country if they can get here. And there's also ways for people who rent out apartments and stuff to prioritize Ukrainian refugees and give them lower rates.
That seems to be like an unfair policy to say. Well, maybe all right, yeah, they can't afford and stuff like that. That'd be cool. I mean, that's like borderline, holding the evictions and the eviction moratorium in the U.S. and, the rent hold and other things like that. I mean, even then, we've seen in the United States a massive uptick in the U.S. bond auctions. And so we've seen the U.S. bond auctions from like January 2022 to February 22. They've risen from like 0.95% to 1.5%. And that's a significant yield in Treasury bonds. I think essentially from this, we're going to see the prices fall and fluctuate, but it is still a large uptick that could be concerning. However, I don't think it's necessarily that worrying. I mean, I'm looking at the graph, I can see that it's mainly, risen and fallen. And I think over the past couple of months, it's increased quite drastically, but that means that it's just going to come back down again eventually, hopefully. I
Uh,
think. Go on.
you said earlier that this is going back to a previous point, but you said that New Zealand has kind of gotten its economy back to pre-pandemic levels, but if they were to partake in the whole sanctioning Russia, uh, you know, trend, I guess you could call it, they would probably suffer heavily in because they import a lot of minerals, oils, and fertilizers from Russia. And so it would be interesting to see if they could actually keep up with that or find somewhere else to import from with similar rates.
I think that's what a lot of countries are in the position currently. I think that with Russia's position, basically not needing anything from the West, they've put themselves in a position to not be dependent on anyone else. They've mainly, especially since they're probably a partner with China where they can supply most of the stuff that they need, they're not really getting, there's no leverage that the U.S. or any New Zealand would have over anything in here. So basically, like, they have no economic leverage on Russia. And so basically, this is echoing the whole liberal economic order since, like, Nixon when he was in office, when he ended the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold in 1971, essentially like making a deal with the Saudi Arabian and the OPEC nations to exclusively price oil in U.S. dollars in exchange for military and political protection. I think that
But
this
wasn't there a
is
whole
go on.
war fought over the fact that one person didn't want to trade in dollars and didn't want protection from America?
Yeah, but when has the U.S. gone to war without the ability to get land or oil? I mean,
And then
when it,
disguised it as nuclear weapons and such.
yeah, that is practically a staple of the U.S. military currently. I think that the ability for us to engage in these types of deal with these OPEC nations, we were basically using the utility of the dollar and its ability to acquire energy. And I think, or energy and oil and make deals with it. I think that considering the U.S. trade deficit that's right now from the Federal Bank of St. Louis, from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, we can see that it's typically the U.S. is sustaining a negative trade deficit right now, and usually it's almost impossible for a country to sustain a negative trade deficit for too long without experiencing massive inflation. And I think we're at like 10% inflation and up right now. And the biggest issue is that, go on.
See, yeah, the negative net trade is kind of surprising, seeing as how Russia has managed to keep a positive one in this whole situation. But in making the dollar not basically one-to-one with gold, America basically made gold its own form of currency in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, like,
If that makes sense.
we're experiencing some form of K-shaped recovery where the outcomes are diverging. And I think, remember when we got off the gold standard, wages and inflation decided to immediately diverge from each other. And I think that this is going to mainly affect the ability for us to keep the utility of the dollar, because we export money and we import things. The U.S. is a net importer, and right now we're lacking in a lot of things to import, especially from Russia and China. And what's happening is we used our corruption, our military, and our influence to maintain the value of our money. But you also can't eat nor run a generator and heat a home with money, nor load a 147 millimeter shell into a turret and fire it. And so essentially, when these countries that we've been exporting for these goods decide that they no longer wish to sell to us, we end up in a situation where all we have on our side is money and very little goods and services. And that puts us in a pretty dangerous position where we've lost a lot of leverage. Our president currently... Yeah, go.
Also, how big is the American gold mining industry?
It's... I don't have exact figures on it, but I do know that it's... I think most of the gold that we would get is probably sourced in China, considering most of the gold that's probably necessary. I mean, there's probably still... we may be on par with China's, gold production, but I think that the amount of technological development going on with contacts and other things like that for electronic stuff, I think that China might be a little bit more ahead of us in that regard. Although I do think that we have our own production, because I do know that our defense budgets do need U.S. made gold to be 100% Berry compliant, and that means that an item is made 100% in the USA with USA materials. So there's a decent portion of that gold stuff. How much of that is being sold on the commercial market, I don't know, but
because coming from a country where one of the main exports is gold, namely South Africa, like many places in Africa, now that the gold is more expensive than the dollar, those countries are going to start, their economy is going to start going up unless their gold is being, sold for a cheaper price, and all that, extortion and corruption and all that sort of stuff.
I think that the biggest hit, besides the arguable inflation and the current increase in gas prices that we've seen, is how Europe is reacting to this. I think that looking at Germany and Europe, mainly with their energy demands, is kind of very concerning, because in 2018, Germany was dependent on Russia for about 70% of their energy needs, and they put themselves in a very weak position to rely on Russia, who is a very aggressive nation diplomatically, so that Germany really wouldn't be in the best position to demand anything or have any type of leverage over Russia. And I think in this graph that I have, that I'm going to put up on the screen here, you can see that the oil, there are some countries that still supply more oil than they demand, and some countries that demand more oil than they supply. And if we were to cut, a country out of the market who supplied more oil than they demanded, the marginal price of the good in question would increase as we moved up along the red demand curve. And the new price is now higher, as no net demand was taken out of the market while net supply was removed. So these sanctions we are currently threatening Russia with are threatening to remove oil supply from Europe, essentially.
Yeah, and one thing that, in reaction to the whole situation and putting sanctions on Russia, Europe has realized that it's probably a good idea to try and get their independence from petroleum and, those hydrocarbons. It's probably a good idea to reduce the amount that they use. So they've actually gone and are trying to move the target year of their emissions reduction target. What was it again? 55% by 2035.
Yeah, 55%.
Yeah, they've actually gone and moved the target year to 2030.
All right, that's a pretty big bump closer.
Yeah, unfortunately, we won't see the Arma 3 date on their target anymore.
Yes, for the few people who get that, that's a video game. But in respect to what's happening with the new adjusted graph with the supply and demand curve here, is that any basic economist could tell you that what would happen in that case, people with money to buy things will go where it's cheaper, and people with goods to sell will go where it's expensive, and people with access to both markets will buy from the cheap and sell it at the most expensive market, the expensive market. And at some point, China and Russia will most likely enact a rule that anyone using their system, probably CIPS or SFPS, would be removed if they were also using SWIFT. I think SWIFT is also one of the biggest concerns right now. SWIFT doesn't hold any monetary value. They're basically an intermediary. They create the transition between the US dollar and other countries' currencies. And essentially what's happening right now is the sanctions that we are putting on not on the United States, but the Russians and their counterparts, by trying to displace them from the SWIFT currency exchange, we're using a 10-year-old tool that both Russia and China spent the last 10 years building an answer for. And essentially, they're going to just start trade in their own sphere of influence. Russia and China are just going to decide to just isolate themselves from everyone else, and we're going to find ourselves in a sphere of influence with useless paper that can't buy any goods because no one wants to use it.
Yeah, it's almost like those whole time we spent trying to globalize the economy has kind of gone back 10 years.
Yeah, there's a lot of setbacks. I think that with this severing of it, there's going to be two world energy markets. There's going to be China, Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, And then there's other outcasts from the SWIFT where they're basically all going to just pull up their stuff and they're just going to basically
And they're
diverge.
yeah, they're going to be fighting, competing against places like Australia and South Africa, who have the coal mines and the natural gases and stuff.
It's this these sanctions, because we're in the U.S. is in no position to have any type of leverage, or even the Western world in general. It's only hurting ourselves and our allies, and that's a really bad just position for us to be in, because, like, I mean, what do we do in response? I mean, the U.S. has literally prepared individual sanctions on Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, like travel bans and stuff like that. But when
Yeah,
Putin is 69 and Lavrov is 71, there are very little chances that they care much about a vacation to Mallorca or something. Like, it's very small
speaking of
chance. Say again?
speaking of speaking of vacations and tourism and such, did you know that one of Russia's main sources of income was tourism? And do
Yeah.
you want to know where the most of the tourism came from?
Where the U.S.?
Ukraine.
I assume that they both have, family, and a lot of people do have family in both Russia and Ukraine. So this is very concerning to those,
Yeah,
citizens both in there and abroad. Um,
which tourism is about 2.3% of Russia's total GDP, which in comparison, coal is 3.8%.
yeah, that's really funny. Where it's like, I wish I had the figure for it, but it's like where your entire existence as a nation is to serve as a tourist spot, like the Caribbean islands or something. It's like your culture has been reduced to just serving others who want to come and take a look at the land, and all you do is just support it.
There's
It's
actually
funny.
a town
Go
I
on.
used to live in South Africa, the first place I lived, where the entire town, there was just a road with restaurants and seafood bars and stuff like that, because the main income for that town was tourism.
And I know South Africa is very urbanized as well. I think that
Yeah.
if anything were to be a sort of analog to what would happen, I think the turmoil that happened in the southern regions of Africa, including South Africa, could be some type of indication on how, you know, this would actually go in terms of the end of the conflict, the economic, outcomes of it. But I think that's all we have time for today. So I think maybe next week or the week after, if anything doesn't happen too much, we could probably talk about that. But I appreciate you coming on, and have a good day.
Yep.
So about that, how do you think the Russian Federation will last with all these sanctions and stuff? Like, it should be costing them a lot of money every day to keep this war going. You think?
I mean, they had a decent amount of money stored up. See, they had, at the beginning of the war, according to the Bank of Russia, there was 640-ish billion dollars saved up
Is that in
in
U.S.?
international funds. Yes,
Okay.
US dollars. Um, but since the beginning of the war, it had a sharp decline, and at the current moment, it is probably around $600 billion now, which the amount that they're spending on trying to keep the ruble afloat by it is yeah buying rubles with dollars is and of course keeping their economy going is roughly $1 billion per day at this point.
So they can't keep this forever. So they're gonna eventually run out of money, is what you're saying?
Yeah, even with their net imports, especially since, Western countries have sort of stopped trading a bit now.
Isn't India buying up Russian oil now?
The thing with India is they're actually getting a pretty big discount on the oil from Russia, so they're not making nearly as much as they could be.
I see. So Russia's heavily relying on their export of the oil that they have currently to be basically sustain itself.
Yeah, that and they do export quite a bit of agriculture as well, so they're not entirely
I think they're
dependent.
the second largest exporter of fertilizers. I think second to China. And I know that we had previous bans coming in with Chinese fertilizers causing, market hikes already in the United States for food and stuff like that. But I think, you know, Russian fertilizer ban is going to cause a bigger issue and prices to almost double again in the future for our current food supply because fertilizers are pretty much bought in advance. So as the stock currently is right now, it's going to be used up and then we're going to see a price hike when they have to purchase new fertilizer. So
I mean,
maybe go ahead.
it does depend on how long this war actually keeps up, because if it stops before we run out of too much fertilizer, then it shouldn't be too bad.
Well, according to your metric of like how long is it, how much is it costing the Russians currently per day?
1 billion.
So we would have, let's see, some quick maths. They'd have about, I mean, like 2 years, right?
Um,
If it's costing them 1 billion a day and they have like 600 billion is what you said, they'd have 2 years to keep this afloat. But that is if
I think
everything
it's
goes
more.
perfectly.
Yeah, I think it's more like a year and a half
Year and a
than
half, yeah. That was,
2 years. And that is, of course, if they don't go full militarized and seize up the economy and whatnot.
yeah, because they are currently stalled right now with the current advance on the northeastern and the southeastern side of Ukraine. So right now they're kind of at a stalemate. They aren't progressing as fast as they thought they would. And that's the issue about invading a country. It's the fact that, invading is somewhat the easy part. It's kind of holding that logistically. Logistics cost a lot of money to keep up. I mean, that's what we happened with, Germany in World War II, and where, most of their Eastern Front failed because the logistics were all cut off and they couldn't resupply soldiers. So I wonder if we're going to see some budgeting from the Russians to basically cover some unforeseen expenditures because it's not going to be always 600 billion and 1 billion per day. There's going to be some surprise cost. Um, but
Definitely.
the current state is like vehicles on the Russian side. The Americans and a bunch of other NATO allies are supplying Ukraine with a bunch of anti-tank weaponry, and we can see the effects of that pretty drastically, where Russia is losing a bunch of its armor regiments like almost every day, including its air assets. And that was, I think, one of the Russians' first goals in invading Ukraine. I think they were trying to make sure they get the anti-air defense systems that Ukraine has out of the way because that would cost them significant losses. So currently they're going to have to recuperate that by developing more aircraft to replenish their supply because even this war, it's somewhat of a small war. It's not like elevated to like a war, like a whole world war. Like, do you think that Russia still needs to be prepared to fight on like a near peer adversary? Like, so like they're not using their top generation fighters, but they still got to make old ones as well. Do you think they're gonna try and balance both the possibility of a future war and Ukraine war?
Um, See, they have to keep into account that they do need to keep funds for uh, the current war, so they can't just go producing brand new, shiny fifth generation fighters all now and stop producing old ones because A, the infrastructure for the old ones is already there and they're cheaper and faster to produce. And yeah, so it would just be more logical to keep producing the older ones until their economy or stop altogether until their economy gets back up.
So like this is the Russians government currently in their pool, but this does seem pretty good in terms of business opportunities for Russian defense contractors. Uh, are there any notable like contracts or deals going on right now with like Russian defense contractors that like lets them profit off this war?
Um, there are a fair amount of war bonds being handed out, I believe. But other than that, I'm not too sure. But I would assume that a lot of the manufacturers getting are trying to get in there, but Russia has so many vehicles in reserve. It's the amount that they're losing right now is like like single digit percentages. So it's not that big of an issue for them.
Because I
Like
know
they're not
for
rushing.
I know for American companies like Raytheon and stuff, this is a pretty big benefit for them considering the ordering from the federal government of more, anti-tank missiles and stuff like that from various U.S. defense contractors. So this is very profitable currently for U.S. stuff. Unless there's more intertwinedness with the Russian government and their defense contractors, where maybe the defense contractors might actually be a like another arm of the government, so to speak, because I mean the Russian government does have some of its lowest debt in terms of like spending. So like they're not. What's their ability to give out like loans to other people to try and get interest on that?
Well, currently, Russia is one of those countries that isn't seeping in debt, but if they were to go and try and take out loans, it would be pretty costly, and in the long term, it would be pretty. Uh, it would have a heavy toll on the economy from medium or longer terms because of, the state of the ruble and the fact that the bank is giving out it was giving out 20% interest rates, and I think it's around 17% now.
Yeah, so Russia really they do want Ukraine. However, like the demand from people, whether it be its own government and its own needs, it needs to, fill in terms of monetary reasons, it's probably going to have to make a hard decision on whether or not to continue this because it could end up bankrupting their entire economy if they end up just pushing and pushing and take out desperate loans even if they are going to do so. It doesn't look like they need to considering they have a pretty large sum ready to go for it. However, as things get longer, the cost will most likely get more and exponentially more expensive.
Um, yeah, but then again, the longer this fight goes on, the less willing or the morale of the Ukrainian people may go down, but that's the same for the Russian troops. So I don't know. It all depends on how willing people are to keep fighting. Because if Russia can get pressure on Ukraine to surrender or something like that, then it'll be over.
All right. Well, welcome back to the last episode of this podcast. A lot has happened over the course of the past month, and we've seen that countries have changed, better or for worse. But I'd like to hear your perspective, considering you grew up in South Africa, and I want to know what you can kind of see where this would be going, considering South Africa has experienced such similar circumstances, I would say. So
Well,
I'll allow you to take off.
well, for starters, in during the era of the Cold War and all the segregation when the main political party was practically authoritarian, sanctions placed on the country, which is similar to what's happening to Russia, which all arms production began. The only people who would trade with South Africa were Israel, and so what South Africa did in terms of arms and
Yeah, wasn't
trade
Israel a
is
major exporter of military equipment to like South Africa, Rhodesia, now
yes,
Zimbabwe, and all that stuff?
and the main firearm of South Africa, the R series rifle, is actually a variation of the Galil and the Fel. But other
Is
than
that
that,
like comparable, not in terms of lethality or whatever, or in terms of just like the weapon, but conceptually, is that the same as the Russian Federation's AK-47, 74, AK-12, and all that stuff?
the Galil is based off of the AK. The R series is based off of the Galil, but it's like taking a AK, making it more based around the economy of South Africa and its manufacturing and standardization. So a few changes, making the stock a bit bigger because there's taller people, Dutch heritage, and all that. And also, it was
So it
sort
was
of
a cost saving measure what the modifications were done to
yes,
the rifles. So like we could see in Russia where a bunch of the AK-12s, which are newer line rifles made to replace the 74 and 47s and the AKMs in the service, we could see that while it may be like a newer, more advanced rifle, like there's no optics on it. There's no red dot. There's no expensive holographic stuff or anything like that of the sorts. And so, like,
you
you think
could
it's
put the stuff
compa-
on, but they aren't.
No, yeah, they could, but they don't have anything to put on it. Like in many pictures of seized weaponry, we see that the only ones who have, expensive weapon optics, red dots, and, scopes are the Ukrainians, because I think the Ukrainian military has to actually, each soldier has more of an emphasis to purchase their own equipment
I mean,
with their own money.
for one, you don't have to supply an army the size of Russia's in Ukraine's army, so they have to spend more to get better equipment for a smaller force to make their fighting effectiveness greater.
So the comparison between those two weapons for South Africa and Russia, where does it compare in terms of how the country kind of went from after, the
So
sanctions and
South
stuff?
Africa became much more reliant on its own production than the rest of the world. It stopped importing technology from the rest of the world and started developing its own. In fact,
So
because of that, it its heads-up displays for helicopters was actually the most advanced in the world at the time.
or that the world and public knows of. Considering the SR-71 Blackbird, the Archangel 12 project was operated for 30 years before the public knew anything about it. So, not saying they weren't the
Yeah,
first, to get the cat out of the bag, but it's a possibility. But
they implemented it and exposed the fact that they had it first.
yeah, so would you think that because the sanctions and the isolation that was technically placed on South Africa, they benefited from that in the long term? Like,
Greatly
so
because
like,
they didn't have to import anything from other countries other than Israel for technological purposes, and they could design everything from the ground up to fit their needs.
so Israel would be China in this case in terms of the relationship South Africa would have, where Russia would have the relationship with China currently, and that all we can really see right now is the fact that this isolation in the position that both South Africa and Russia were in, that it both stands to reason that they would only benefit from this in the long term.
Yeah, currently Russia still relies on the West for some, you know, aircraft maintenance parts,
But does it
and
need
stuff like
to?
that. Um,
Do you think they'd be able to recover?
Eventually, they would definitely be able to recover because they are quite resilient when it comes to their own manufacturing status because they were behind everyone in the First World War. They were not. They were one of the last people to kind of figure out tanks and those sorts of things. And then in World War II, they managed to completely. So they started off getting help from the Germans, and then eventually, the moment they got double crossed, they managed to pull all their production into some mountains and outproduce German tanks,
Hmm.
which is quite impressive for when you definitely weren't prepared for it.
I think there is a stigma still going on that Russian technology is less technologically advanced than those of the Western world. Same thing for the Chinese world. Even where China's technology might look more advanced, however, its reliability and its effectiveness may not be on par with that of the U.S. counterpart, in which they most likely copy everything from their F-35 jets, the M4 clones, all the things like that.
Night
Um,
vision.
Night vision, of course, yeah. But I think that people, even this war currently, whether it depends whether or not the Russians are pulling at all their stops, where they're saving all of their high-tech new generation tanks and stuff for a near-peer adversary threat, maybe like a full world war, or maybe the military power they're committing right now is all of it, and they're using 60s era Cold War technology with kind of some new
I mean,
upgrades.
aren't there some images of people with Mosin Nagants?
There is some images of weapons made before 1900, the Mosin PU. That's
I mean, it's still an effective rifle. I mean, it's the same bullet. It says it uses the same caliber, the 7.62 by 54R that, Dragunovs, PKMs, all those high caliber or armor. I guess it is kind of armor penetrating, but
not really,
yeah, it's not
especially
really,
with
but it's
the
still
yeah.
it's the same round effectively.
We could see the cost cuts in the Russian military in terms of the weaponry and the stuff that they're putting out, and in correlation to South Africa, which we're trying to use to figure out where this could possibly go. What cost-saving measures did that military produce during its time of isolation and conflict?
I mean, for one, since they had all the natural resources to actually produce things, they cut costs by not having to import already manufactured equipment, so they didn't have to pay for the cost to actually, you know, the man hours essentially that comes with an already made product. And so they actually improved their economy because they could actually export things now.
Okay, so we're to summarize the if Russia follows the same path that South Africa was following, we could
Apart
see
from the whole economic decline and
yeah.
corruption.
Well, I think South Africa didn't really take the best turn, considering that it still wasn't the size, scale, and in the current geographical location next to an ally who's very willing to help them out. Um, I think
Yeah,
that Russia would probably end up emerging from this entire conflict like far greater than Ukraine would. I think what's going to happen is Ukraine's never going to be the same. It even might just be completely annexed from by Russia itself, and no one's going to do anything about it because I think no one's in a position to do anything about it. I think a
yeah.
lot of people are not willing to escalate into an entire whole war over a country that isn't a part of NATO. But what that does is it gives Russia a big buffer, and that sets up the possibility for if China were to take Taiwan, and we still have a very soft president in the United States currently in office, that we would be set up for a very different world war if it were to occur. I don't think it would occur nuclear, but that's a whole other debate. I think the evidence is clear is that most countries want the land, and they've been
Yeah,
okay with the land currently. But I think that if no one does anything with Ukraine, it only emboldens both Russia and China, and that sets a very dangerous precedent for the rest of the world. That the big,
yeah,
powerful
because
Western superpowers and European superpowers will do nothing if you're not a part of NATO.
yeah. But here's the thing. At the moment, so it seems like Russia is having a lot better um, time in the south of Ukraine, which is Ukraine's only sea-based ports. Well, I guess only ports and external only way to get to the sea. And if all of that is cut off, it's going to be much more difficult for them to export without paying fees throughout the rest of the Europe transporting their goods. And it's also going to make it more difficult for things to get in at a lower cost.
It's going to
And
significantly disrupt a lot of trade in the waterways.
yeah, and Ukraine, because of all the artillery strikes and missile strikes and people just fleeing the country, um, their GDP has actually gone down almost to half what it was.
I'm assuming that's because all their factories are bombed, all their infrastructure, all their roads, all their networking. Like the amount of money necessary to recover, and the inability for them to have the services to do that is going to present a huge, huge issue. And the only way they're
Yeah,
going to be able to recover is if Russia backs out entirely from everything that they've taken and allows other people and other sources like NATO nations or UN stuff to come in and humanitarian aid and provide repairs and stuff like that. But that doesn't look
yeah,
like
and
what's the case.
I mean, currently NATO and some Western countries are trying to provide financial support to Ukraine to keep it from completely imploding.
Yeah, because
But
NATO is only a defensive pact. They like it's not an offensive pact. They can't declare war on someone else because another nation
yeah,
that's not a part of NATO is there. It's, you know,
but no matter how much financial support you give a country, people leaving a country, if they don't come back, you are going to be in deep trouble. Because coming from South Africa, where the majority of people in the country are uneducated and are not in a position to actually improve their situation enough to leave the country, you are left with nothing but workers who can do basic tasks. And it does not help that a good portion of your educated people who can do research, medical practice, uh, government work are all leaving the country to find better work in other places,
it's a
which is actually a situation happening in Russia right now.
yeah. I can imagine that, including all the protests that citizens have been having. That anytime you try and speak out against the Russian government, they immediately just silent your dissenting position by basically putting you in cuffs and bringing you away, essentially into the new 21st century gulags. We've seen that in the United States. Liberal college campuses suppressing other viewpoints, kicking them out, suspending students, social media suspending dissenting narratives and stuff like that. I mean, there's a whole new wave of
Yeah,
censorship going around, and Russia is the prime example of what that whole censoring just on the internet in the U.S. could turn to. Like
also
it's
on top of that, there's a difference between someone who is educated and is willing to, I guess, speak up on a topic and basically show individualism than there is for a person who is, uh, you know, like them, but keep their mouths quiet and just follow what everyone else thinks because they're less likely to innovate and actually help with the progression of a country.
I think it's also
Because,
that, like what you said,
yeah,
it's about individualism, and I think the issue is that since Ukraine and Russia are so close to each other, there's so many things that are just similar. They're like almost family. The relationship they have between each other are very similar, and I think it always
I
boils
mean, they
down to
speak the same
people think,
language.
yeah, almost the same language. It's just that the thought of just following orders and how the fact that that never holds up in any of the trials for in the Hague or in the actual you know in any of the previous war crimes committed, just following orders was never a thing. Like, people are like, oh, but then you would be killed if you didn't follow orders. Yes, that's the point. If the only reason why Putin is so powerful is because he has an army of good, obedient little soldiers. Those who are
Yeah,
choosing to obey. This war would never happen if all the people, all the military members decided to say no. These are we don't want this. And you can see whether or not through all the propaganda on both sides, because this is war and psychological
yeah,
warfare is always present. there is, you know, still a shred of truth to the fact that some people didn't know this war was happening. Some kids are very young. Some kids don't want the war to happen because Russia is based on a conscription army, while Ukraine is based on voluntary. Well,
Yeah.
unless you're a man and you're in the age range of something, you can't leave the country. You have to go fight, which is a bit, I think, unethical because it's not that place to decide. But I think the consequences of this conflict are greater than that of the Afghanistan conflict and that of the Crimean conflict that happened in 2014. I
Yeah,
think
because
that
here's
keep going.
another side effect of people who are specialized and highly educated being either taken away from out of the system, out of the economic system. Like in South Africa again, the fewer people you have who are uh, educated, the fewer people you can have educating the next group of people, which means you end up having fewer and fewer because then another percentage of the next generation leave, and then the next generation leave, and then you have fewer and fewer and fewer every generation, and it just becomes worse.
I would agree with you on that, but I think we're getting too far from what we can accurately depict on what's going to happen, and I think we've reached the limits of what we're able to compare from it. But I appreciate your insight and using your own experience from growing up in South Africa and having the connections with your grandparents and all the information that's been passed down through that. So I greatly appreciate that, and I think let's just hope that everything can go well, but it doesn't look like it. It looks like there's a rough time ahead for the Ukrainian people and both other governments as they try and recuperate from this. But I thank you for coming onto this podcast.
Look,
And
as long as there's not a fourth grade educated president, I think the world will be fine.
yes, this is not the South African presidential cabinet. We do not have fourth grade educated, people leading the defense contracts.
No, you just have senile people.
Yes, we just have senile people with an earpiece in the ear, uh, you know, with multiple handlers. But that's all for it. So thank you and have a good day.
Yep.